The second era that I want to talk about is the post-independence era, so the era after 1947 through to the end of the 1970s. And so important to note that there was historically a long process of seeking and then obtaining independence in India through the nationalist parties and movements, and then there was the major disruption of the partition of India. So not dissimilar to, for example, Japan after World War II, or as we'll talk about in the next lecture, the China and the Soviet Union when they adopt communist systems of government. It happened after a period of major disruption. So important to take that into account in judging the economic development outcomes. Indian economic policy in the post-independence era is usually described as being a planned approach to economic activity, and that potentially can be explained by beliefs about economic development during the colonial period that were prevailing at the time of independence. So, for example, the idea that India had been disadvantaged by being exploited by foreign capital during that period, and that it had been disadvantaged by a relatively laissez-faire market-based approach to economic activity. And that then, the argument goes, meant that there was a predisposition towards implementing methods of organising economic activity that moved away from laissez-faire towards a more planned approach, and that meant that there couldn't be this exploitation of foreign capital, so that placed barriers to involvement with the international economy. The planned approach to India's economy was essentially implemented through Nehru's 3 5-year plans. These plans had a focus on industrialising the Indian economy through heavy industry. For example, the goal being for India to become a major producer of goods like iron and steel. And as we'll see in the next lecture, this was really built on the Soviet approach to economic development. The government seeking to promote industrialisation, in particular to promote industrialisation via heavy industry. And so, for example, how does the government do this? Well, half of the investment in the iron and steel industry in the period of the planning period, the 50s, 60s, comes from the government. So the government basically takes on a role of through its own financing, deliberately promoting these activities. But it also comes from erecting barriers against international competition in production of these goods, and through subsidies and tax breaks. And as we saw in the very first data slide, this strategy of trying to force the pace of industrialisation in India is accompanied by the fastest growth in India's history. So by trying to increase the orientation of economic development towards industry, towards heavy industry, the Indian government is able to achieve higher rates of economic growth than had been occurring in the preceding period. But as we also saw, that the rate of economic growth during this period of planning slows, and is slower than in many of the other high-performing Asian economies. Partly that's due to external influences. So there's a series of droughts that affect India in the 1960s and early 1970s. There's also the disruption of the OPEC oil price increase And there's also India's involvement in several wars during this period towards the end of the planned economy period in India. But there's also some structural influences, one of which is the role of the state in economic activity. So the Indian government has the strategy of trying to direct economic activity towards industrialisation, and it does that by taking a relatively extensive role in organising economic activity. For example, there's a licensing system introduced which says that to invest in a particular area of economic activity, you need to have a license from the government. And so that licensing system is relatively cumbersome in terms of the amount of time it can take to get a license, and becomes a deterrent for a new investment. There's also the large government role through creating public monopolies to produce some goods and services in the Indian economy. And so that also is generally regarded as having slowed the rate of economic growth in India. In fact, if you think about the timing of the rates of growth in India during this period, we saw that in the 50s there was 2% GDP per capita growth, then about 1.5%, then about 0.7%. And so that actually matches with the increasing role of the state in economic activity. In the 50s, India has the goal of industrialising, but for example, initially in the 50s, it's still open to foreign investment, and there's not the extent of barriers to trade, not the extent of regulation of industry that there comes to be in the 60s and 70s. So in fact, as the role of the state gets greater, there's an argument that the rate of improvement in GDP per capita got slower. Also, as I mentioned, in the early 50s, it takes India still remains open, but eventually in the 50s, India starts to turn away from the world economy, introducing high barriers to imports and to foreign direct investment. So in 1914, India's exports plus imports as a share of GDP are 20%, but by 1970 that's declined to 8%. So India turns away from the world economy just at the time, as we've seen in the previous section on globalisation in the 20th century, when the world economy's opening up, and there potentially would have been increasing scope to exploit comparative advantage in agricultural production. There's also low rates of infrastructure investment, low rates of schooling, an orientation towards post-secondary. So really a quite unequal system of schooling in India based on caste and gender, where higher socioeconomic status groups could get access to education all the way through to university, whereas there's a large section of the population for whom even primary education remains not something that it's at all easy for them to acquire. So for a variety of in this period, Brad DeLong has a nice quote where he says that India's, to the extent that you want to think of India's growth performance as being slow, it's in relative terms, not absolute terms. So in absolute terms, India's growth in this period of planned economy is relatively strong, much stronger than had been the case for the 100 years before. And that seems to be because the planned economy was successful to some degree in shifting economic activity towards industrialisation, where labour could be more productive, and that raises GDP per capita. But it's also the case that relative to other Asian economies, India's performance was not as strong in terms of the takeoff in economic growth, and that seems to be due to the factors that I'm describing here. Final part that I want to talk about is the takeoff from the 1980s. And here what we're really going to see is a different model of growth. that in particular in India, the economic growth that's has come from an increased role of and productivity growth in the service sector. And that's quite different to what we've seen for the high-performing Asian economies, where we saw that the growth was from shifting to industry and from high productivity growth in industry. To build a little bit more the perspective on the composition of economic activity in India, which I talked about earlier, here there's sectoral shares of different sectors: agriculture, manufacturing and services. These are the shares of GDP. So you can see agriculture during the period of the reform period from the 80s onwards declines from about 38 to 20%. Manufacturing increases, but not very much, about 2%. The big increase instead is in services. Because agriculture is a labour-intensive activity, the numbers, the employment numbers, they follow the same direction, but they're a little bit different in terms of their levels. So employment in agriculture in this same period went from about 68 to 59%. Service sector employment went from about 20 to 29%, and manufacturing employment was about the same. But whichever way you look at the numbers, or whichever numbers you look at, the story is that what we've seen is shifting out of agriculture and into services. So the Indian economy in this period from the 1980s to the present has reduced its agricultural has reduced the share of agriculture in economic activity and increased the share of services in economic activity. Here's the second point that I had on the first slide about the 80s, the point that productivity growth has been relatively rapid in services. So first of all, there's two time periods here, 83, 93, 93 to 2004. One point to note is that productivity growth in agriculture, while positive, has been much slower than in the other sectors, and that the service sector, where economic activity has been increasingly occurring, has been a sector where there's been relatively high rates of productivity growth. And manufacturing, there's also been productivity growth as well at reasonably high levels, as you can see. So not only has economic activity been increasingly directed towards the service sector, but the service sector has been the sector where there's been rapid productivity growth occurring. One big question about economic growth in India during this period is to what extent it's explained by the major economic reforms which took place in India. And so these reforms, we're talking about three major areas. First of all, very substantial reduction of barriers against international trade. So, for example, tariff rates on consumer goods from 83-84 to 2004-5 are reduced from about 110% to 50%. Tariff rates on intermediate inputs, that's goods and services that are going to be used as part of production in India, fall from 150% to 40%. There's a removal of barriers against foreign investment, and also the undoing of some of the licensing system that required licensing in order to be able to invest in a new area of a new business, new enterprise. And there's also very significant unwinding of government ownership of businesses, both in the banking and finance sector and also the utility sector, with a large-scale privatisation program. Now, one issue that's been raised is, well, look, most of those reforms took place in the 1990s onwards, yet we see economic growth taking off from the 1980s. So can reform really be the explanation for what's happened in India? What caused growth in the 1980s? Did the 1990 reforms matter? The answer to that is to say, first of all, well, of course, the reforms in the 1990s couldn't have caused the growth in the 1980s. So we need to think about other explanations for the growth in the 1980s. And there's a variety of explanations that have been proposed. Some economic historians, economists have said that, well, there were the forerunners of the major reforms of the 1990s in the 1980s. For example, a more pro-business orientation in India in the 1980s, and that's what we should think of as a driver of increasing growth in the 80s. Other commentators have argued that rather it was the effect of ongoing diffusion of agricultural innovations in India. The Green Revolution changes, for example, from the 60s onwards. It was their slow diffusion, increasing rates of economic growth, or that the nationalisation of the banking sector, which occurred in India around that period, caused increased savings and investment rates, which underpinned the growth that had occurred. The other part of the answer is to say, well, look, then when we look at the 1990s, it does seem that these reforms that were put in place do have something to do with the continuing growth in the Indian economy, the fact that the high rates of growth we observe in the 1980s don't just die out, they continue into the 1990s, and the fact that they accelerate. So the reforms of the 1990s can't explain the whole of the Indian growth experience, but they're generally accorded an important role in thinking about why growth was as rapid as it was after the 1990s. Now, as we've talked about, the big driver of this growth that occurs from the 1980s onwards is the shift in the Indian economy from agriculture towards services. The early growth in services in the 1980s to the early 1990s was in trade, construction and transport, which seems to have mainly been driven by growing demand within India for those services. But then in the 1990s we have a phase where the main driver of service sector growth is growth in communications and business services. And here it seems that what's happened is we've had a coincidence of India having a high-skilled workforce which was able to supply services to the communications and business services sector at exactly the same time that there was rising international demand for IT services, facilitated by deregulation of the communications sector in India. So there's sort of been two phases to the growth in service sector in India, powered by different forces. That explains the growth, but as I've mentioned a couple of times, an issue that's often raised about India is, well, why hasn't the growth been faster? And here it seems like there's a couple of structural factors that explain that outcome. First of all, agriculture remains an important part of economic activity. And so when you have an economy where 50% or so of the employment is still in the agricultural sector, and where that agricultural sector is still, while large number of innovations introduced in the period after the 1950s, still a lower productivity sector than, for example, manufacturing or the services sector, then that's going to limit the extent to which economic growth occurs. Related to that is the issue of why manufacturing industry hasn't developed. So usually the process of development, as we've talked about, has been that agriculture becomes a less important sector, manufacturing becomes a more important sector. Here, agriculture has remained an important sector and manufacturing hasn't really developed. And so several sort of main explanations for why manufacturing industry hasn't developed in India in the way that it might have, for example, in some of the other high-performing Asian economies. First of all, the composition of industry between organised and unorganised, which I'll say something more about in the next slide. Inadequate infrastructure, in particular public infrastructure, often regarded as a contributing factor, and also restrictive regulations. So government regulations such as the type of licensing regulations that I talked about before, for a long time constraining the growth of manufacturing industry. Now, in this slide, I've got a table which gives you some information about what are called the organised and unorganised components of Indian manufacturing industry. the Indian regulatory structure of industry has a requirement that any business any industrial business with more than 10 employees or more than 20 employees, if it's not using electricity in its manufacturing processes, has to register with the government. And that registration means that the business is subject to the Factories Act, which imposes a whole lot of requirements on the business in terms of regulation of working hours, regulation of labour conditions in the business. And it seems that the effect of that dichotomy of having regulation of businesses above a particular size but not below a particular size has been to really promote what's called the unorganised sector in Indian industry. So if you look at these tables here, you look at the table, you see that there's 130,000 organised enterprises, 17 million unorganised, 37 million workers in unorganised, only 6 million workers in organised. But obviously the organised have much more workers than the unorganised. It's clear as well that the organised are more productive enterprises. They pay much higher wages, they're more likely to be obtaining external finance, and the value of their output is much greater. So a problem for Indian industry has been that there's a disincentive for businesses to set up in the organised sector, yet the organised sector is the sector which is most likely to promote large-scale industrial development through, for example, being able to take advantage of economies of scale, being able to access external capital. And so a major problem with Indian manufacturing that has been an impediment to its development is this misallocation between the organised and the unorganised sectors. And so one study, for example, estimates that if you were to reorganise economic activity in manufacturing industry in India so that it was actually efficiently allocated between businesses that are operating, you could improve TFP in a stroke by about 50%. So you could get a 50% increase in productivity in industry by simply solving this problem of misallocation. Another study has shown that, so in a couple of slides ago we saw that there's actually been reasonable productivity growth in Indian manufacturing in the period from the 1980s onwards. What this study showed is basically that all of that productivity growth has occurred within the organised sector in businesses that are more than 200 employees. So a major issue for Indian industry is changing the structure of industry to allow larger scale enterprises to develop to take advantage of the productivity benefits that come from operating at that larger scale.